The United States just managed to pass a highly controversial resolution in the United Nations Security Council, which basically transforms Gaza into a UN mandate and makes Donald Trump its governor. Resolution 2803 has already been heavily criticized by human rights experts like Francesca Albanese and Craig Mokhiber. The puzzling thing in this is that Russia and China both abstained from voting, thereby helping the resolution to pass. To help understand China's position on West Asia, I'm today joined by ZHANG Sheng, a non-resident visiting researcher at Turkey's Koç University, and the author of a very popular video on YouTube where he recently explained Chinese approaches toward Gaza. Sheng, welcome.
Nice to join you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for doing this, because let's maybe start with your video that you actually posted a couple of months ago, and that by now has more than 500,000 views, in which you try to explain how China is approaching, like politically and socially, West Asia and the Palestine question. Could you maybe give us the gist of what you explained in that video already?
Yeah. So basically, like the main theme I was trying to convey is that first, China and Palestinian National Liberation Movement has a very long history of solidarity and camaraderie existing that you can trace it back even to at least to the 1960s. And if you are trying to talk about China's friendship with Arab countries in general, especially the left-leaning nationalist liberation movement, you can trace it back even to 1950s. And since then, the China has been trying to support the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and that thing continued until today. So I was trying to explain like how this thing historically evolved, and what are the different changes, like different phases it went through from 1950s to 60s and 70s. 60s and 70s were the most, let's say, when China was having the most radical stance in supporting the Palestinian liberation movement, and have the most radical opinion over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the entire among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. And when it gets into 1980s, mainly influenced by events such as the Oslo Accord, and also like before that, the Egyptian peace talk with Israelis and things like that, the Chinese stance become much more moderate. And also because of China's growing economic investment in the region, so China started to become closer to Israel at this time. But meanwhile, it comes to a very rather self-contradictory and awkward situation that China, in political sense, has been supporting Palestine until today. But in the economic sense, for the last about 10 years, China's investment in Israel has been going up, going like very, very closely until the war in Gaza, which we are going to talk about in a minute. And in that phase, basically, the Chinese were obsessed with economic trade and things like that. And also in 2016, the Chinese were, I would personally say that, but I mean, like, not everyone believed the same thing, but like, I would personally say that the Chinese were fall to the trap of Netanyahu in 2016, when Netanyahu came to Beijing, and he was trying to, he said a lot of like pretty things and inviting China to invest in the Haiba Bay port, and which the Chinese did. And that turned out to be a very bad deal, as we are going to talk about. So that's for that phase. And the third phase, I think most people are mostly interested, is what happened after the Gaza war, right? So so what happened after the Gaza war is that right after the war started, right, the Israelis were trying to do what they did in every other countries. They are trying to push the Chinese to, in terms of a political stance, to condemn the Al-Aqsa operation, which Al-Aqsa flood operation, which the Chinese refused. The Chinese use a very ambivalent type of tone, saying that, well, we condemn any violence against all civilians committed by any actors, and they just don't want to make any like pro-Israeli statement, and they just want to like make a more balanced and pro-peace type of statement, saying that we just don't want to see civilians getting hurt, and that thing is the main stance of China on this on the October 7th issue, and Israelis were not happy with it because they were thinking that you have to be like the United States or Europe doing, and you have to condemn the organization by name, and you have to like use a very like one-sided supporting Israeli narrative. And the Chinese government continue not to do that, and there were a lot of like diplomatic conflicts going on in this era, and that also leads to within Israel, there's an increasing number of interest groups trying to argue to the government, saying that we should basically like we should like strip China's investment away from the Haifa Bay port. We should just don't let the Chinese to continue run the Haifa Bay port because they don't support our war on Palestine. So that became a huge issue. And also when the Israeli aggression into southern Lebanon was going on, Haifa was quite unstable. So that again also like hurted the security of the Chinese investment there. The Chinese were the trade volume between China and Israel actually dropped a lot. Like that's the first drop ever since the 2013.
So the Israelis actually actively discussed how to punish China for not falling in line.
Yes, they do. Yeah, and you can find that in their official media. They were trying to like literally I think the chairman of the Ashdod port, which is the Israeli government run port, basically the chairman of that port was writing publicly on Israeli media, right, and also like wrote a special report to the Israeli government, telling them that the Chinese were not on our board in our on the October 7th issue, but also like on the Gaza issue in general. And for that sake, we think that the Chinese are not in line with the national security of Israel, and we should just we should tear our statement, like our treaty with China. Like China and Israel signed this deal for like running the Haifa Bay port for like 25 years. And so basically he was arguing that we should like tear this apart. And that thing became very popular in Israel among the discussion. And besides that, the Israeli embassy also have been trying to do a lot of activities in Beijing, trying to basically like mobilize their friends in Beijing to force the Chinese government to condemn Hamas and to like take a more pro-Israel stance on the Gaza war. So that those things are the origin, I would say, the origin of China's diplomatic tension with Israel for the last 2 years.
How did that go down in China, like in political Beijing, but also in the larger Chinese social media sphere and public media sphere?
Yeah, and I would say that the Israeli propaganda campaign ended terribly. Like on the governmental side, there's lots of some trace. We can talk about that later. And now we can talk about like, let's say, the grassroots, how the Chinese netizens reacted to this thing. Is that so after this round of the Gaza war started, like because it's the majority of the Chinese understand this thing as the continuation of this prolonged Arab-Israeli conflict, and especially Israeli aggression into the Palestinian land.
Yep.
And but the Israelis want to promote this idea as like October 7th is the beginning of the universe, right? Like nothing.
Yeah, the singular moment where a completely, utterly peaceful, never ever having used its army before, Israel was suddenly out of the blue attacked by the most evil and vile terrorists that the world has ever seen.
Yeah, exactly. Like nothing existed ever before this day, and this day is the birth of universe. Like so that's the idea they are trying to promote. And very interestingly is that the Israeli embassy in China has been spreading misinformation. I would say, let's say, use a Trump term, fake news through this day, because one of the hostage taken by Hamas to Gaza, her name is Noah Argamani. Her mom is Chinese and she's Israeli citizen, not Chinese citizen at all. She was born in Israel, have nothing to do with China at all. But the Israeli embassy, from the first day, they launched this fake news saying that this woman who was born in Beijing is now taken to Gaza as hostage, and trying to like appeal to the national sentiment of the Chinese masses. And after that, they continue to tweet things like this, saying like, "Oh, she's half Chinese. Her mom is worried about her. Netanyahu is worried about her. Netanyahu was so worried that he personally called the Chinese embassy to say like, if there's anything the Chinese can help with rescuing this half Chinese person out of Gaza," and things like that. And first, this is fake news. And like, of course, she is one of the hostages. That's true, but she's not born in Beijing. She has really nothing to do with China. And second is that when they're doing this propaganda, eventually because this thing become a huge deal that the Chinese foreign ministry got asked about this thing like for several times. And eventually what happened is that this slightly like, let's say, pro-Western stance Chinese media made an interview with the person's mom, which was the Chinese person, and she's Israeli citizen now. And what they figure out is that first she was one of the students that China sent out to study abroad, and then she just like tear off her agreement with the Chinese university and escaped to Israel and married an Israeli guy and never came back.
She never came back. So she was supposed to come back because she got a grant from
Yeah, because she take the scholarship from the Chinese I think the scholarship council or something, and that was in 1980s or like 1980s. So she's supposed to come back to work and like to finish that agreement, and basically she just tear parts of the agreement and never came back. And in that interview, she was quoting quote, she said this thing. She said, and the journalist was saying that, "Oh, people think that you are not Chinese citizen, and do you still have Chinese passports?" And like basically, the journalist was trying to help her to appeal to more Chinese netizens. And then she said the following, quoting quote. She says, I'm Israeli citizen, but does this mean that you Chinese don't have the duty to help me?" And that became the most disastrous propaganda I have ever seen. So after that, the Israeli embassy just never talk about this thing anymore because they feel like this is bad. So they started to play other cards. For example, on the Women's Day, they organized this event. The Israeli the consulate in Shanghai organized this event playing the feminist cards, like saying, "Oh, this is International Women's Day, and there's like female victims of the attack of October 7th," and trying to like do that. And after that, they also like on using Chinese media platform, they publish a large number of statements, not only like criticizing the Palestinians or the Iranians later, but also criticizing the Chinese government, saying that we are like deeply disappointed that the Chinese government is not doing what we want them to do. And the funny thing I'm going to share is that this is a Chinese owned platform, right? It's not Twitter. It's called Weibo. It's a basic Chinese version of Twitter. The Chinese government never shoot this thing down, and they just leave it be. Like, okay, so this authoritarian government doesn't care like you publishing public statements criticizing them. But because the Chinese netizens are so furious about what the Israelis are doing, both in China but also like the crimes of war in Gaza, so they flooded all the commenting sessions of the Israeli embassy's Weibo account. So this only democracy of the Middle East, what they did is that they closed down the commenting session. They closed down the commenting session. They put into the mode that only certain views, like which like they select like before, can be showed in the commenting session. this is like amazing example of democracy. So,
And that in and of itself then also probably became another topic within the blogosphere, I suppose.
yeah, exactly. So people get like really like amused by this thing. People are like, oh wow, like this is the amazing democracy that like the West has been talking about. Is like they cannot even like tolerate the Chinese netizens' criticism to their actions.
No, like, it's pretty clear by now. The freedom of speech is the freedom of you to say what the West wants to hear.
Yeah,
And if it's something else, then it's not covered by that rule anymore. Not covered. I mean, that's as sad as it is, but that's clear by now. So, and this in relation to Israel also, at least online, must have had quite an educational effect, I suppose, about what Israel is. Also, this sense of entitlement, right? That spoke so clearly from that mother of one of the abductees, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's quite like because like from as I was talking about from the 80s, like yeah, like China established diplomatic relationship with the regime of Israel in 1992, but since the 80s they have some sort of like de facto relations, and for the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years. Lot of because a lot of Israeli institutions also investing in China, and academically they have cooperations with the Chinese universities and institutions as well, because especially like Israel is quite advanced in natural science, like, some high tech stuff. So there was this very, like, let's say, a very close phase, and a lot of pro-Israeli propaganda also gets into China, before this thing. And people, like once people thought that Israel must be a very highly like educated society, and everyone reads, like there is a myth about like every Israeli person reads more than 60 books a year, and that was like the standard like stereotype of Israeli citizens in Chinese like pop culture before what is happening in Gaza in 2020 in 2023. But with what is happening in Gaza is happening, the younger generation of Chinese, they were, for the first time, I think they're started to go back to the Maoist traditions of 1970s. They started to read what in 1970, like there's a lot of like publications of books or documentaries made in the Mao era talking about why armed struggle in Palestine is something that China supports in that era. So the young people in China today, they're like digging out those previous publications of the 70s or 60s, and they started to like systematically read what is happening and what has happened in what was the origin of the Palestinian issue, and they started to form their own independent thinking on the Palestinian issue that is very different from what where the mainstream academia has been teaching for the last like 30 years.
So, would you say that today, after now 2 years of genocide in Gaza and like very public broadcasting of all of this, and also the discourse that grew up around it, including, of course, Francesca Albanese and all of the human rights advocates who then are being demonized by the Israelis, but also the Americans and the Europeans, by the way, um, is this now kind of also in China reinforcing this impression that what we are seeing is just blatant colonial enterprise by the West to occupy to occupy that piece of land? And does that now remind China or Chinese citizens also of their own century of humiliation, of how they were treated? Because it seems that you're saying that before that was not the perception, but is that now changing?
Yeah, definitely. I think absolutely. Like, I would say that like the Chinese young citizens today, like especially like those like who are using internet, the young netizens, they are probably the generation that has the the least favorable, or like let's say the most negative perceptions of Israel that ever since 1970s. And this is quite a huge change, because 1970s, that was very remote. That was Mao time, the Maoist era of China. And after 40 years of let's say, different narratives like about Israeli-Palestine issue flourishing in China, and now people go back to like what they believed 40 years ago. Like this younger generation of China has I would say, the most negative perception of Israel, and also the narrative, like it's very common in China for people to compare Israel to the fascist regime of Japan during World War II.
Yeah.
And like, and also like often to Germany as well, which is a huge thing that would irritate Israelis and the entire West. But in China, we have a different aspect of political correctness. So this thing is not the untouchable taboo in China, and you would find that on Chinese internet, people often make those comparison of what the fascist Japan regime did during World War II, especially the Nanjing massacre, compare that to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza today. And sometimes they also like even compare what the Nazi Germany did in terms of genocide to what Israelis were doing in Gaza today. And that type of comparison sometimes also, let's say, gets incorporated within the government by like sometimes very high officials.
Everything that you're telling me now actually makes the decision of Beijing to abstain from that resolution with which I introduced this talk even more surprising. I mean, all of this would point toward China actually, now taking a stance for Israel, not for Palestine, not just for Palestine, but also in order to, appeal to their own population, because China does care about. I mean, official political China does care about public sentiment. Um, how do you explain to yourself that they abstained from that vote, and how is that currently being viewed inside China?
I think that's definitely a very controversial vote that even within China, there's a lot of like voices of not understanding, or also like critical voices. Like for example, like I myself, I'm not really a fan of that abstain. But let's say if we want to explain why they did that, they choose not to vote in favor of it for obvious reason. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was saying that the largest problem they see about that resolution is that it does not mention that Palestinian territory must be governed by Palestinians.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that's the basic like principle that China has been holding, right? At least in political languages. And also the Chinese were still are still in this process of believing the two-state solution, which is also a controversial point that maybe become less and less feasible. But the official stance is also talking about two-state solution, and China is very disappointed that that two-state solution is also not written in the resolution. So it's like you can find that they are definitely not happy with it, and they make this very outspoken. But why is that they still let it pass? I think is because if you look at the, let's say, habits of Chinese diplomacy, you find that it's a very, how to say, I don't want to use the word conservative because like it has political meaning of like, yeah, like conservative, but like it's a very, sometimes like very overly cautious type of, overly cautious, overly obsessed with balanced and this type of stance. And they often only veto things when they feel like, when they're sending a message that I veto this, that means like I'm strongly against this type of thing. And that means that even if you guys are going to do this thing, I'm going to sabotage the plan. That's the what veto means in Chinese diplomatic mentality. Like like for example, like we have been vetoing a lot of like for example sanctions against some countries, for example DPRK, like North Korea.
Mhm.
And that means that, okay, I'm vetoing this in the UN platform. And I know that Western countries are still going to sanction DPRK or still going to sanction Iran, as you guys are trying to do. And vetoing means that, okay, when you are trying to sanction, I don't care about your sanction. I'm going to actually actively participate in trading or giving aid to this country.
So
Or
okay, so in this sense, a veto to China means I'm actively going to fight against
yes,
what's
yeah,
happening. And so in this sense that they abstain from this one means they're not supporting it. They don't want it to happen, but they're not willing to go all the way to fighting it,
yeah.
which would actually mean picking a fight with Israel.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that's why, because the Chinese were like, they treated the veto thing too serious, like
Mm.
comparing to like what like United States treat the veto thing too not serious, like they use it casually. But for China is like they feel like the government does not have the determination to say that over the reconstruction of Gaza issue that we're going to actively do something that like can change the entire situation. And
Mm.
to be honest, China probably don't feel like it is able to do that at this moment, because
Right.
it's too far from China. We don't have that much of assets, like economically or like in other forms in the region. So that it would be like, I think that what they think is like, it would be bad that if we veto the thing and then Trump does what he wants to do, and then we have nothing to do to like save the situation. Like that would be a sabotaging the diplomatic credibility of China. So that, I think that's the reason why they abstained.
That's a very interesting explanation, and it's also a good observation. The United States treats the veto at the UN as, if I do not 100% support something, I will veto it. And China treats it as if I do not 100% oppose it, I will not veto it. So it's, but this now, okay, this now creates, though, a very important precedence, which is again why it surprises me that China didn't veto, because it's the United Nations Security Council is the only body politic we've got that can make binding resolutions on the entire UN body. I mean, this resolution is now, for all means and purposes, going to be part of international law of what has to be obeyed by everybody. And it's not just, as the US, as one US diplomat ambassador once said about the Security Council resolution, it's not just a recommendation. No, 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 it's binding. This is now
Mhm.
this now has the force of the entire UN, which is why it is so outrageous. But still, China was willing for that to happen.
Yeah, I would say it's a very unfortunate issue, and I don't understand why they did not see this like as serious as we see it. I think
Mm.
I'd say, I'm not trying to justify their like a judgment, right? I'm just like trying to say, if we want to understand why the government did such a move, one possibility is that they just like they don't feel like UN laws are still that important, especially in the case of Palestine. Because, like in the past 2 years, there's a lot of efforts in the international law aspect trying to stop the Israelis from
Yeah.
committing the genocide. And even China was in the ICJ supporting the South African case against Israel, and China was in the ICJ speaking in favor of armed struggle in Palestine, and asking the Israelis to stop the what they are doing, like we need to stop the war crimes immediately, both in the Security Council and also in ICJ, in all other, and also in the General Assembly, in all of those platforms. But that changed nothing. I think that's probably the reason why the Chinese feel like the UN laws don't make that much of change, especially binding what the Israelis can do. So they are not serious to it. That's probably like, I would think that's the only way to understand why they did so. They just feel like, okay, even if we veto it, the Israelis are going to do this thing anyway. And if anyone wants to stop the Israelis, that must be the resistant powers in the region itself. while the international law seems very powerless in this situation. So they probably for that reason they didn't realize. I think it's a failure to realize the importance of vetoing this type of basically like imperialist resolution.
This is troubling. I have no problem believing your interpretation, but if true, then it would mean that uh, that the belief in the United Nations as an institution that, despite the fact that it has no power or that it is relatively powerless, that the rules or the international law around it is weakening, because China so far has always repeated that international law is the guiding star and international law need to be adhered, and the UN Charter is the base of everything, and within that understanding, you would need to be very careful of such resolutions. But if you're right, then the pragmatism in Beijing would now say, like, well, why pick a fight with Israel and the United States over something that, even if we veto it, wouldn't change a damn thing anyhow, and Israel is just going to run rampage anyhow. So give them that and let them fail with their board of peace.
Yeah, I think that's probably like the second the second assessment you mentioned. I think that's probably like what they were thinking, because they feel like, even as I said, like even if we veto it, we don't have the power to sabotage that plan,
Yeah.
right? And by vetoing, but the Americans and the Israelis do whatever they do over Gaza, that is going to only hurt the so-called strategic credibility of China. Like whether I mean, like I'm not saying like I agree with the assessment, but that's probably like how they think of it. And then they were thinking that probably the only thing that can stop the Israelis is not international law, but the resistance from the from like within the region, like resistance from the region, uh like which would troubling the Israelis and Americans at the same time, that would probably like push them to change the idea of what they want to do.
Okay, that does make sense. But overall, where do you think that leaves now the larger Chinese foreign policy toward West Asia? I mean, Palestine is not the only West Asian country suffering from relentless
Mm.
decades of bombarding. I mean, the entire West Asian space, everything around Israel, basically lies in ruins, including Syria, Lebanon, including then also, like, the previous victims like Libya, Iraq. It's one inferno over there, and the West, of course, portrays all of this as, oh, the indigenous Arabs are just not able to get their stuff together. This is locally done. By now, we understand this is a deliberate policy in order to weaken everybody, so Israel can more or less do its thing. How do you think Chinese foreign policy is going to approach this entire region from now on?
Yeah, I think what the Chinese foreign policy toward West Asia has been doing in the past is that there was this contradiction that existed in the Chinese foreign policy in that region, is that politically China is definitely like more close to Iran, and China needs Iran because like in terms of political strategy, you need a powerful anti-US regional power in the region to distract the United States, so that the United States does not pour all of these resources into confronting China in East Asia, right? So that's the idea that China has been thinking. I think that's still the mainstream idea. But economically, because of the difficulty of trade with Iran and things like that, the economically China has been quite dependent, like not dependent, but like heavily intertwined with the American allies in the region, like the Gulf states in particular, and sometimes also Israel. And the Chinese were seeing this thing as like for the last, like I think before the Gaza war, and also like before the Israel-Iran war, the Chinese were thinking that this thing can at least continue for a little while. They want to maintain this idea as like so-called everyone's partner in the region, and then they don't want to pick sides on regional wars and things like that.
They want to be neutral.
Yeah, like to stay neutral. And then like basically the Chinese government wants to imitate what Russia has been doing, because Russia was like largely like it was like saying that it was the friend of every major country in the region. So China was trying to do the same. But with what is happening in the last 2 years, I think this thing is no longer going to continue. As I was talking about, even the Chinese investment in Israel cannot stand this type of geopolitical conflict, right? Like you think that you can invest in Israel while maintaining in close relationship with Iran. Like even the Israelis would not allow that thing to continue, and I think this is not going to continue. And I think what happened is that in the last round of Iran-Israel conflict, the Chinese were very disappointed that Iran was sort of like suffered too much, like more than people expected them to suffer. And that put Iran into sort of like a more disadvantaged situation in the region. So I would imagine that what the Chinese are going to do for the next few years is that they're going to increase engagement with Iran more to like make sure that Iran does not fall. Because from the Chinese perspective, the fall of the Assad regime was not a good news for China. The Chinese were surprised by that, and Syria until today has very weird diplomatic relationship with China. Like this, like Giuliani government has very weird relationship with China, and that type of normal diplomacy has not fully restored. So I think the Chinese were seeing this as like quite a surprise, but also a sort of like a historical lesson to learn. And it would be a very important for China to keep Iran not to collapse or like not to be like severely damaged. And so that's what I think China's strategy toward the West Asia would, in that sense, be more like supporting the recovery of Iran and its allies in the region.
Do you have do you have any hunch on how Chinese foreign policy now views, the terrorism term? Because I mean, Al-Jolani, Syria and Hamas. I mean, Al-Jolani and Hamas are a perfect example for good terrorists, bad terrorists, right? The terrorists we like, we put them in power, we trim the beard a little bit and put them on TV. And the terrorists we hate, we don't only kill them, we also kill all the civilians that are some form of support structure, right? I mean, and just get rid of them. And so on the one hand, this terrorism is a farce, an utter farce. I mean, to the same level as now narco-terrorism is a farce in order to invade Venezuela and so on. But on the other hand, China also has historically problems with their own terrorism, which they framed as terrorism, especially in places like Xinjiang. And anti-terrorism is, of course, one of the reasons for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in order to combat like transnational violent group networks in East and in North and Northeast Asia. How do you view China approaching the terrorist issue from now on?
I think it's a very interesting that for China, because like China, like the People's Republic of China emerged out of guerrilla warfare, right?
Yeah.
So the guerrilla warfare against the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, but also against Japanese invasion. So China's perception of like the word of like terrorism has a very like different take, I think, from like the West, well, at least from what the United States and Europe. So first, like China has made it very clear that armed struggle against occupation normally is not considered as terrorism in China, in Chinese diplomacy. And this is in the official document. Like, for example, I was mentioning that the Chinese representative, I think he's the director of the Chinese Department of Treaty and Law. He gave the speech in ICJ, and he was citing all the international laws and saying things, and he just want to make one point, is that people in the occupied territory has the rights of using armed struggle against the occupiers, and that was a huge thing of Chinese perception of armed struggle, and that thing continues from Mao era until today. It never changed. Even when China's relationship with Israel was the closest to this thing, would never change, and the Chinese always recognize that Palestinians have the rights of armed struggle, and since I think because as we know, like China has close relationship with the PLA, with the PLO, and especially with Fatah. So, but even like on the view about, let's say, some like religious Palestinian organization like Hamas or the Islamist Jihad, the Chinese were just they still the official policy is not to label them as terrorist organization. In 2000, as early as 2003, when the Chinese official media interviewed Sheikh Yassin, the former leader of Hamas, they described this thing as armed organization or like resistant organization. And in 2016, that is under the current administration, under Xi Jinping's administration, the Xinhua News Agency, official media of China, published this stipulation telling people that how to use formal languages in news reports. And there's one particular clause saying that do not call Hamas a terrorist organization or extremist organization. So it doesn't mean that China loves Hamas, but means that at least China does not want to label that type of organization as a terrorist organization. But meanwhile, what the Chinese were mostly like sensitive about is religious extremism. So I think for the Hamas case, it's just like the Chinese feel like even we don't like their ideology, but we have some sort of sympathy towards the fact that there are people living occupied land. But with Julani, I think that's a very different case, and China has been quite skeptical and critical of the Julani government, like ever since very long time ago, especially because his relationship with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, which is listed not as a terrorist organization, not only within China, but also by the United Nations. So what the Chinese has been trying to do in last a few months is that trying to like negotiate with Julani, saying that we can possibly recognize your administration and doing everything, but you need to make a promise of not cooperating with those figure, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement terrorist again, and try to most preferable ideas to like return those people back to China. But even if that's not possible, just at least like trying to like you have to make a clear statement saying that you would not allow those organizations to use Syria as a base against China. That's the same thing what the Chinese did to Taliban after Taliban took power in Afghanistan, is that the Chinese are aware that Taliban in Afghanistan has a close relationship with Taliban in Pakistan, which is bombing Chinese investment in Pakistan often, and has some connections with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement. So what the Chinese were like eventually did with Taliban is that even if we don't urge you to like return any of those figures to China, but like just don't allow them to do any activity against China in your territory. And in exchange for that, China was basically sending out economic aid and like improving trade with Afghanistan, even like after the Taliban took power. So, yeah, so I think it's a very practical thing, and the Chinese are very, again, like very not conservative, but like sort of like inward looking in terms of a lot of international affairs. As long as an organization is not explicitly launching attack against China's own territory or like Chinese people abroad, the Chinese were like very flexible with it and like refrain from making moral judgments over this type of organizations and complexities. Yeah.
That does make sense, because at the end of the day, I mean, the other sides, they also all work with these organizations as
Yeah.
well. So it's like, why expect China to be the outlier and not work with anyone? Um, Maybe, one of the things that not infuriated, but really that really made me shake my head very, very much was when about 2 months after October 7th, I think it was December 2023. We already understood that what is going on is collective punishment in Gaza and amounting probably to genocide. I mean, the genocide accusation was already out, and that was the time when actually
Mm.
the government of South Africa started its genocide case at the ICJ, and at the same time, the United States with Israel's co-signing signed a bill like in the UN. It wasn't a resolution; it was a declaration that they are heavily opposing the genocide in Xinjiang.
Mm.
I just couldn't believe that this is the moment when they do this. Um, how is this use and abuse of, very, very fundamental and important concepts of international law, international law, then now being perceived in China? I mean, obviously it must hate it, but what is this now leading to a way also for the public to review how they understood how the West is using concepts?
Yeah, I think this what happens in like throughout the Gaza genocide until today is a really important political lesson for the Chinese masses to understand the double standard nature of the West, you know. And especially like right before that, as you were talking about, the West has this like years of making various propaganda about the Xinjiang policy and trying to relate that into genocide. Well, the actual genocide is happening in Gaza. They just like never refer to the thing as a genocide, and that thing really like amazed and like not in a negative way, like shocked to the Chinese, and to see like, oh, like is this the really like what you are doing? And like Israel also does that, is like I think ever since 2019, if you look at the mainstream Israeli media has been reporting a lot of things about Xinjiang issue. And Israelis are like, okay, like suddenly they care about Muslim religious rights. They suddenly care about like so-called genocide allegations and anything about that. Like, but when Gaza was happening, like they just like keep not talking about anything like that happening. So I think I think this is a really like interesting moment for China to realize the double standardness of what they're doing, and then the Chinese for the like the Chinese government also, I think it's very important to figure out to point out that in the beginning the Chinese government was like, I think, driven by that sort of like overly obsessed with balance type of obsession. They did not call the war crimes in Gaza as genocide, but that thing actually changed in this year in August, in August of 2025. There was this report like called Reports on Human Rights Violations of the United States in the year of 2024. And that thing is an official document released by the Chinese State Council of the Information Office of the Chinese State Council. In that report, you can find it online. Literally says that United States is accomplice to the genocide in Gaza. So I think that's the first time that in official Chinese document that they actually refer to what is happening in Gaza as a genocide, and that's quite an important thing. And in also some figures of like some figures in the Chinese Foreign Ministry in their more private talk, they have been using the term genocide like even earlier than this document. Like for example, the General Council of China to Osaka, Japan, like Jian, like you probably know that he's quite controversial and right now.
Yeah, he made a statement a couple of days ago. Yeah.
Yeah, about what is like about that. But the funny thing is that he was controversial about Israel like even before that. He he on his Twitter he posted a lot of photos of like comparing Israeli war crimes in Gaza to the Nanjing massacre, and he described the Israeli actions as like genocidal actions. And then the most interesting thing is that he even made a post in June this year comparing Israel to Nazi Germany. And he made this post, and I'm going to quote him. He says that the only difference between Israel and Germany is that Germany treats the United States as an enemy, but Israel treats the United States as its ATM. And
Oh, wow.
and he put the Israeli flag and then the Nazi Germany flag to together, and said that thing in as the text like below, and then he posted this thing on his official like Twitter social media, and that thing made the Israelis super angry, made the Americans super angry. So he was already like very so-called controversial and outspoken on this issue before like the China-Japan issue, right? But I think what he's doing is like at least to show that within the Chinese government, there have been a large number of high-rank officials who have the view that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is a genocide.
But,
Yeah.
sorry, I just need to ask because he's a consul in Osaka, so he's an official diplomat of China. He's not an honorary consul; he's a full consul. Yeah.
Yeah, he's
So,
there, and also I think his position is general counsel, but he's let's say he's like ambassador level.
rank.
His
Yep.
rank is ambassador rank,
Yep.
so he's a very high level of diplomat.
And you cannot post this kind of stuff without either direct backup or like being sufficiently sure that this will stand and will not cost your neck, because otherwise diplomats wouldn't do that. Because they have their own, they depend on their ministry, right? So in a sense, this post has more or less, if not the approval, then at least the fine go ahead with it of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, I would assume so. I think at least you would have some sort of like acquiescence from rest of the people in the government, or like there's a large group of people in the government holding similar opinions. Otherwise, you wouldn't post those type of things. And that's like after he posted that, like nothing happened. Like there was like it's not like the foreign minister get angry or something. So I think definitely like that shows there's a large number of sympathizers to Palestine within the Chinese government, and I think that leads to the aforementioned reports on human rights released by the State Council, like directly using the term Gaza genocide.
This leads me to my last question, but the Gaza genocide taught me a lot about Zionism and the difference between Zionism, Judaism, the state of Israel, and so on. Is this also the case for China? Because in my view, you cannot understand what's happening without understanding what Zionism is and how it works, and Christian Zionism and that backs it up, the entire project. Is that also now part of the discourse in China, or is that still a more opaque affair?
It is the discourse, I think. It's I mean in the government, I think there's a huge like generational division. In the government is definitely like the older people are in charge, right? So they're more talking about two-state solutions and believe that two-state solution can bring everlasting peace.
Yeah, the Oslo Accord of the 1990s. The 1990s mindset, yeah.
Yeah, like those type of mindset, and I think that and I think that's also like they're largely influenced by Fatah.
Mm.
So they think that if Fatah says two-state solution is good, like why are we judging them? So just let them be. So like this type of thing. But I think in the younger generation, there's more serious talking, like even like challenging the very nature of Zionism, and that is a very very interesting thing because China, like if you look at history, like since 1920s, China has already known about Zionism. Like Sun Yat-sen, for example, he met with Zionist leaders in Shanghai, and because and he expressed like sympathetic views towards Zionism because he feel like Zionism is a nationalist ideas held by a small group of oppressed people of Europe. So it must be good. That was his idea, and that thing continued. I think continued later, and also like China has a very long and interesting history with the Jewish diaspora. Like in during the Nazi Holocaust, a lot of
Shanghai.
Jews went to Shanghai and take refuge there, and they also had their own newspaper and own community networks. Many of them later returned to Israel after the establishment, and so the Zionist organization was there functioning and had like built a lot of connections with important figures in the nationalist government of China in that era, and even with like there's also like a lot of like Jewish comrades in the Chinese Communist Party as well. So it's some of them in very high positions, and I think in the political council conference of 1988, think most of the foreign communist foreign like most of the, let's say, CPC members who are foreign citizens are from Jewish origin. So there was this very long connection, and for that reason, like China was so like I never buy into the concept of like right now, like a lot of people saying like China is anti-Semitic or something like that. Was not the case, and through those interactions, the Chinese actually like have a lot of understanding of what Zionism is about. Historically, they did not see that as a problem until the 60s, when the state of Israel started to like invade everyone else. That made Mao started to feel like, oh, this is actually a very bad thing. So they started to explicitly say that China's state the official stance is against the Zionism. And so that's the literature of the 70s that I was talking about. And this thing later faded away after the Dengit's reform. And because like China has two-state solution, right? So like they started stopped like questioning the legitimacy of Zionism. But now with what is happening in Gaza, the young generation started to like dig out the things of the 70s. And it started to think that whether Zionism by its nature is an imperialist idea. Like they started to pose this type of a question. And even in academia, in I think last year, Ilan Pape's book was published in Chinese, like translated in Chinese language and published in Beijing. And that was a huge deal. Like Ilan Pape, he himself went to Beijing to advertise that type of thing. He had some sort of events with Palestinian embassy in China, and the elderly generation Chinese scholars are still like little bit afraid of his ideas and say that like maybe like we don't know whether we should label Zionism as a bad thing or not. Like we hesitate about that, but the younger generation started to find that thing quite popular. So I do think that this generational difference is quite obvious, and that makes me feel like in the like let's say next 20 years or something, when this younger generation started to take more important positions in the government, like China's policy can be much more pro Palestine than it is right now.
That was a tour de force, a very broad overview and very good insights. I mean, Sheng, I thank you very much for this. People who would like to read more from you or to see more of you, is there a place where you occasionally or so publish your thinking or your analysis?
Yeah, I often write for Global Times. So sometimes you can see like my articles on Global Times, but Palestine related thing, I published the an article on the Transnational Institute, and the TikTok video was based on that article, and I can share the link of the article with you. And I also have some like academic articles on that topic as well. But I think the one I was mentioning is more readable and related to some of the things we talked about today, such as how the Chinese masses and the Chinese government reacted to the genocide in Gaza and things like that.
Please send me these links. I will all put them into the description box of this video below. Sheng Zhang, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Yeah.